My name is Cecilia Van Donselar of the Mary Isham Keith chapter of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. With me is Dawn Needles, who will act as a scribe for this interview. Today's date is September 9, 2020, and this interview is being conducted in Trophy Club, Texas. We are interviewing Terrence Dake, who served the Vietnam War in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So, General Dake, would you introduce yourself and your information?
I will. Thank you. I'm General Terry Dake, and I'm talking to you from my home in Trophy Club, Texas. At the time we're talking, I'm 76 years old, but I entered the Marine Corps when I was right out of college. So I was 24 when I went to Vietnam, but I was born in Omaha, Nebraska, although I was raised in the Missouri Ozarks, so I've always kind of considered myself to be a farm boy, even though I was born in the city. My mother, her name, her maiden name, was Clyda Margaret Laughlin, and she was born in Stella, Missouri, which is in the southwest corner of the state in the Ozarks. So when you hear about hillbillies, that's kind of where I grew up and where my family is from. My father is James Earl Dake, and his family was in Nebraska. He was born in a place called Surprise, Nebraska, and he was born on the 9th of September 1911. Unfortunately, he passed away on the 17th of April 2001, although he had a good long life, and I think that being raised on a farm, and that's how he grew up, on a farm in Nebraska, kind of gave him a very down-to-earth view of the world. My mother was born in 1920. And she was born in Missouri, and then, of course, later, as I said, at the age of 72, she passed away also in Missouri. I have two brothers and two sisters. My brothers, one is Dennis and the other is Kevin. I have sisters, Marvis and Tanya. And so there were five of us when we grew up together. There's quite a gap between my sisters and I, or Tanya and I should say, because my parents divorced, my mother remarried, and there's about a 15-year difference in our ages, so our family was spread out to do that. But I did grow up in Missouri. I went to high school there and elementary school. I went to a small work college called the College of the Ozarks. I graduated from there in 1962. At that time it was a two-year college, and if your grades were high enough, they gave you a scholarship to allow you to go on and finish. So I went on to the University of Arkansas and got my bachelor's degree from there. I'll come back to the College of the Ozarks in a bit. I currently chair their board of trustees, but when I was there as a student, it's one of those colleges where you show need, and they have a top-notch education that you will get. It's a Christian college. And while I was there, my job, and everybody has a job, my job was working in a furniture factory. And I used to joke that if I didn't graduate from college, if I flunked out, I could be a cabinet maker. So I had a backup plan in case all that didn't work out all that well. But after I left college, and when you start looking at veterans and the time that you start, I joined the Marine Corps soon after I graduated from the University of Arkansas. In fact, it was from there, we're talking 1966, when I graduated from Arkansas, the Vietnam War was ongoing. And everybody was going to war that was my age, of a fighting age. And I had been on a deferment for most of that time while I was in college, so I was pretty certain that when I got my degree and got out, the draft was going to catch me very quickly. So I started making plans that I would like to control which branch of the service I went into. And I chose the United States Marine Corps. A lot of reasons for that. First, they're very fit. And if you look at my generation, people coming back from World War II were all around us. They were our mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles. And the story of the Marine Corps in the Pacific Campaign, Iwo Jima, Tarawa, all of those campaigns were really still being talked about. And I like the ethos of the United States Marine Corps, their physical fitness, And they also had the best looking uniforms too, I should say. So I joined the United States Marine Corps, and they offered me a contract to be able to fly. I always wanted to fly. And the Marine Corps would give me a guarantee that I would be able to go on to flight school. So I joined the Marine Corps, and after college, my mother drove me to Joplin, Missouri. The Marine Corps actually had bought me a ticket. And in August, the Officers Candidate School at Quantico, Virginia was to begin, so I was flying from Joplin, Missouri, going to go through Chicago and land in Washington, D.C. and go down to Quantico, Virginia. I'd never been on an airplane before, even though I wanted to fly. I'd never flown. But I had this ticket, and my mother drove me to Joplin, put me on that airplane. I was dressed up in a coat and tie that I'd graduated in, and my only coat and tie, I should say. And when I got on that airplane, I felt this is going to be quite an interesting time. We flew to Chicago to change airplanes, and lo and behold, the airlines went on strike. So here I'm caught in Chicago, never been on an airplane before, pretty much a country boy. So I'm a little out of my element, but I said, it's okay, the Marine Corps bought me the ticket, they'll understand that, the airplanes went on strike. What could I do about that? So I spent the night in the terminal and caught the very first airplane that I could to go on and complete my journey. And of course, by then, that starched shirt that I had on was all sweaty and dirty, and my suit was wrinkled. And I got to Quantico, Virginia. Thought I had an airtight story. I can't control airlines. Marine Corps bought me the ticket, but that's not how the sergeant saw it. Oh. So when I reported in, and he says, you're a day late, candidate. They called us candidates when we went to Officers Candidate School. And I explained to him, just painstakingly, how that all went down. He says, if you really wanted to be a Marine, you'd have found a way to have gotten here on time. I don't think you're going to go anywhere in my Marine Corps. And I have to tell you, at that time, I thought he was probably right, that I wasn't going to go anywhere on that. But that was just the first day in the United States Marine Corps, and we went through Officers Candidate School, and that teaches you the very fundamentals. And normally a Marine officer, and you're commissioned once you get out of Officers Candidate School, which is 11 weeks essentially, and then you are commissioned a second lieutenant, and then your real training begins. And most Marine officers go what they call to the basic school and learn how to become platoon commanders. Troop leading steps, all about the uniforms, all about weaponry and those kinds of things. But lo and behold, with Vietnam going on, they needed helicopter pilots. They didn't need platoon commanders. They sent me straight to Pensacola, Florida, where I went to the Naval Flight School. And of course I thought I should have been a jet pilot. I could see myself up there going faster than the speed of sound, alone and unafraid. But they needed helicopter pilots. So I became a helicopter pilot, and probably the best thing that ever happened to me in doing that. Soon after I got my wings, and I need to mention my wife Sue at this point, because she and I began dating when I was in Pensacola, Florida. She pinned my wings on me, and then we knew Vietnam was in the future. That was just a given. So she understood that. And we got married on April the 5th, 1968. And we thought we'd have almost a year or 9 months before I'd have to go to Vietnam. And 4 months later, I was in Vietnam. So that didn't work out quite like that. But we found that in those early days of Vietnam, I actually spent 13 months there. So in 1968, in August of 1968, in a squadron called Marine, it's a heavy helicopter squadron, HMH 462, and we flew a new aircraft that the Marine Corps had just gotten a few months earlier in that same year, called the CH-53. It was a cargo kind of helicopter that I would fly, and my squadron deployed together. Now that was important because back in 1968 the war had been going on for quite some time, and we're starting to send replacements over, ones and twos and that, as opposed to whole units. And it makes a just a considerable difference when you're with a unit and you know the people in your unit, as opposed to being the new guy who just got stuffed into a unit. So when my unit went, we put the helicopters on a ship out of California, and then we went home on leave for a few weeks, and then we came back and actually flew from California, and in this case it was out of Tustin, California. That's where my wife and I got married, by the way, on the base and the chapel there we got married. So, but we got on an airplane, the squadron officers and all the enlisted men, the maintenance personnel and all of that, and we flew up through Alaska, on over to Japan and on into Vietnam. And we married up then with our helicopters, which had gone by ship to get across the ocean. And of course, Vietnam was a war that had been going on a long time, and there were a lot of difficult days that were part of any war that you're part of. But we flew into Da Nang, which is in the southern part of I Corps. Well, Vietnam had been divided up into corps, starting with one corps in the south, and I Corps all the way to the north, up by the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. So that's where we flew into Da Nang, spent the first night in the war zone, and of course we could hear airplanes. It's an air base, and we could hear airplanes taking off all night long, going to Burner, and the place where they had us in a transient barracks was right on the end of the runway, very close. So we listened to those airplanes all night long taking off and landing, and you could hear sometimes explosions in the far, far away, and but we knew we were in a war zone. It was not much sleep that night, I think it was fair to say. We were all pretty tired, but it was a trip, but we were excited and a little uneasy about all that was going to go on. So the next day we worked our way up to a base called Phu Bai, and that's where, it's an air base also, and that's where our squadron would be located, and our helicopters were there, and so we began flying missions out of Phu Bai. Now, the air war in Vietnam, and you have to remember that was the first real helicopter war. We could do things in helicopters that could not be done before. We could put troops out where you could not reach them by road and resupply them by helicopter and medevac them and do things that kind of let you go where the enemy doesn't know you're going to go. So we actually had a different way of fighting, and it was being examined and studied and developed even as we were there. So we flew in what I call the I Corps area, and of course you always wonder, well, were you where the shooting was, and what went on at that time? And Vietnam was indeed intense sometimes, and other times when you weren't starting an operation, there'd be a lull. It doesn't mean you weren't flying and doing things, but you weren't getting shot at as much. And there were no front lines that you could kind of go to the rear and be safe and all that. Everything was kind of floating with, you didn't know who your friends were from the Vietnamese. You like to think the people on the base were all your friends, but some of them were not. Some of them were Viet Cong, guerrilla kinds of warriors. And we would find that even just transiting from our base to where we would pick up loads like a Vandergrift and then carry them out to where the units are in the field, just flying in transit like that, you could be shot at because there were no front lines, no safe havens. And what we had going for us was that these shoulder-fired missiles like we have today, like you see the enemy, they weren't there in big numbers. So our biggest threat were people shooting machine guns, fired rocket-propelled grenades, those kinds of things. And we thought if we got high enough, like 2,500 feet and above, they weren't very accurate at that. So we felt pretty comfortable that we could transit at those altitudes. Unfortunately, Vietnam has weather that doesn't let you get to that altitude some days, so you're forced under that. And when that happens, then you go as low as you can and fast as you can, and try to avoid enemy buildup if you know where they are. There was only twice that I wasn't able to get my helicopter back to base. One time I had an engine shot out. The round, we were doing an emergency resupply to an Army base that was out by Quezon. And the weather was terrible. In fact, it was a rainy season, and if they had not declared an emergency out there, they'd been in contact over the night, and they were running out of ammunition, grenades, and things of that ilk, and did not think they could make it through another night. So they declared an emergency, and I was asked if we could find them. The weather was pretty bad. So I had been out there the day before, or the day before that, and I'm pretty confident that if there's any visibility at all, that I'd be able to get out there and do it. So I took the mission, and we loaded up with all that stuff, and we flew out there, found it pretty easily, and unloaded without one shot being fired. And they'd been in contact until 2 hours before, but the enemy broke off contact just before we got there. Good news for us, I thought. But as we came out of the LZ and tried to find our way back, remember, we didn't have things like navigation kinds of things. We didn't have night vision goggles. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have those kinds of things. So you needed to see roads or a river or a hill, something that you could identify on your map to do that. So I'm flying down a road, and very low because the weather really was bad, and less than a mile visibility. And unfortunately for me, the enemy was withdrawing down that same road. So flew right down the column, and of course that set us up as a turkey shoot for them. And we started taking a lot of rounds. One round hit a fuel line to the engine and that. But we didn't know it until I pulled up into the clouds. I figured the only way I can get away from these guys is where they can't see me. So I pulled straight up. Didn't take long. We were covered by the clouds, but we had been in a valley. So I'm flying trying to stay away from the mountains and do a spiraling climb out. And about the time we get up into the clouds and we're settling on the gauges, because obviously you're an instrument flying at that point, the number one engine flamed out because the round had hit the fuel line, and fuel was pouring out into the cabin, and it was pretty exciting. But we weren't able to stay in a tight turn and a climb. We could do one or the other, but not both. And now we're on one engine, so we went spiraling up, then we went spiraling down, back down. And, fortunately, when we broke out, we were able to recognize a river crossing that we could see and establish where we were. But we weren't going to get home that night without helicopter, so I flew to, I could fly single engine, and I got to a point where I could recognize a base that had Marines on it. It wasn't a base, actually, it was just an encampment. And I thought if I could put it down there safely, I'd save my crew, and maybe it would save the aircraft, and we did. So it was exciting for a while, but I always felt good that we got the airplane on the ground in one piece and none of my crew were injured. So we felt good about that. So those were the kind of excitement that goes on for an hour or two. And then another day or two we could have done resupply time after time without any kind of shooting going on. Vietnam was just that kind of a war. You hear things about the Vietnam War that I now have been in the Marine Corps for 34 plus years, and I've heard how people are now recording that war as being one in which we had a lot of protests going on back home, the anti-war protests at that time, and those things. And people talk about how rapid drugs were, and how some of those soldiers didn't want to fight. I heard all those negative things, but I have to say, not once in all my time, I spent over a year there, did I see drugs, nor did I see anyone who refused to fight. It just wasn't like that. So it kind of irritates me when I see shows that come on and people come on and try to tell the real story about Vietnam, and then they say things that I know are not true, and it pretty deep-seated anger in me for that. You know, sometimes when people came home, they were not welcomed home. It wasn't a hero's parade in New York City. It was, in fact, sometimes people would would spit on you, or that didn't happen to me. But I see episodes where in fact it did. But we landed at, I think it was Travis Air Force Base in California. Remember, my squadron all went at the same time. We all came back nearly at the same time. So we called it the Freedom Bird, and we're on 13-month tours. So as you're getting close to that 13th month, you start thinking, hey, I might get out of this. I'm going to live through this. And that was always in your mind. And then you'd go back down to Da Nang and get on the Freedom Bird and come home. And then we landed at Travis Air Force Base in California. But a person got on an airplane, an Air Force person, and said, welcome back home. Glad y'all are here. But you might want to take your uniforms off before you get off the base, because people will heckle you if you don't. Well, that just angered us all. We determined we're going to wear our uniforms wherever we wanted to wear our uniforms, and whoever that was would just have to put up with us, and they better know how to fight. So, I mean, it was that was kind of a different coming home, only because it seemed to be in all the news and all that. It wasn't so much a personal thing that I had experienced. I just seemed like there was just an angry time in our history of the U.S. There were racial issues that were ongoing at that time, back in the late 60s and early 70s, and of course the Vietnam War. So I was the first lieutenant during Vietnam, and the next war I'd go to, I'd be a colonel, and I always have had an opportunity to understand the difference between what's it like down in the trenches, and later on, what is it like when you're farther removed from that. One thing I should mention while we're on Vietnam is I had two types of tours. I flew helicopters, we just talked about that, but I also was a forward air controller with the infantry. So I was with the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, a very well-noted history of the Marine Corps, and they call them the Walking Dead. You know, they were through Khe Sanh. I wasn't with them at Khe Sanh, but joined them soon after Khe Sanh was over. Khe Sanh, of course, was the siege in which the Marine Corps, there was an air base there, or landing strip, I should say, and it was in a bowl with high ground all around. And the North Vietnamese saw an opportunity, perhaps, to get a great victory, and all the public relations or the press that would go with all that would be a real coup for them if they could wipe out a Marine Corps unit. But the United States had great air superiority. We also had a lot of artillery. So even though they had superior forces all around us, they were constantly under a bombardment of air attack, artillery attack, but it was a difficult time. A lot of Marines were wounded and killed in Khe Sanh. But that unit, when it was over, those battle-hardened Marines, I joined them. Now I'm an aviator, they're infantry, but there's a great bond among all Marines, and we were an air-ground team. And I've always felt good about the opportunity to have that tour with the infantry, in which I learned so much. And we spent all of our time out in the jungles of Vietnam and places like that, coming back for a short period of time, getting a shower, maybe getting some clean utilities and a good meal, and back out again we would go. And I made a lot of good friends who are lifelong friends, and some of them, of course, made general officers as well, and we would talk about the lessons that we learned. And I always thought I had a better understanding as a Marine pilot because of the time that I'd spent with the infantry and understanding their issues as well. So I always felt fortunate that I'd had that tour as a forward air controller. Of course, my job as a forward air controller was to control the air and to talk the air onto targets. So my radio operator and I would move forward so that we could see and call in airstrikes that we would direct many of them. Other times we could give coordinates, and then the pilots would find the coordinates in the target as well. But always thought that was an interesting aspect, and I now, with my friends, as I come back, and we had some reunions that come, the aviators, that, at least in my squad, none of them looked forward to going out and being a forward air controller. I don't know if any of us did. In fact, I'm not sure I looked forward to it when I was going to go. But I had been trained before I left the States to be a forward air controller, so when it came time and something came down, your squadron has to give us 2 pilots for forward air controllers, I was a natural because I was trained. Turned out to be a great experience, and it's one of those things I'm very proud to serve with my ground brethren in the Marine Corps that we do. So after 13 months in the Marine Corps, or in Vietnam rather, I came back, and Sue and I were sent to a base on the East Coast. That's in North Carolina, next to Camp Lejeune. Camp Lejeune is a big ground base, but there's the New River. There's a helicopter base right across the river, and that's where we were stationed, and we did that. You know, in this day and time of 1969, by the time I came back, there's a lot of unrest in the United States. Kind of reminds me of what we're going through now in 2020. That we see riots, we talk about racial issues and that was happening back in those days as well. And a lot of similarities, in my opinion, as of that. So we came back, and we were there for a few years, and I went to a school, and amphibious warfare school. And then I was assigned to a helicopter squadron that supports the President of the United States, Marine Helicopter Squadron 1, also called HMX-1. And it was quite an interesting experience, and I would be in that squadron off and on for almost 9 years. I'd be there for 4.5 years, then I would go away to a staff tour, and then I was assigned to come back to that squadron as the commanding officer and the President's helicopter pilot. So it was a bit different over time, but I spent, by the time it was over 9 years in that mission. And it's an interesting mission because the President of the United States has 2 jobs. One, he's the head of state, so he meets other presidents and prime ministers and queens and that. And then he has the title of Commander-in-Chief, in which he directs the armed forces of the United States. And when you fly him in a helicopter, you've got to observe both of those missions. He can never be out of touch where he can't be reached by radio. And if you're going to be flying the President of the United States and he's going to be on live television and they're going to start the cameras at 16 minutes past the hour, you better land at 16 minutes past the hour. So there's all different aspects of that mission that I found to be intriguing. And I start thinking about it, and I think it's where you're touching the history of the United States. And over that period of time that I was in that squadron, of course, I met several presidents. The first president that was in office at the time that I was there was President Carter. Actually, I should back up. President Nixon was on his way out. He had just resigned, and he left. That was in 1974. And so within a year, he was gone, and President President Ford, who had been vice president, became the president of the United States. So I got to meet President Ford and to fly him as a co-pilot on that. And then President Ford lost the election and President Carter came in. And once again, we switched and met that president. And then President Carter lost to President Reagan. And I'd gone away by that time, gone to a headquarters Marine Corps staff job. Didn't think much of that, but everybody does them. So I got and did that, and then I was sent back to HMX-1 to be the commanding officer. And that's when President Reagan was in office. And I felt very privileged to fly a president that was so well thought of, and that I believe is one of our great presidents. You know, we fly all presidents, so it doesn't matter whether you're talking President Carter, President Reagan, President Ford, whatever they are. They're all the commander-in-chief. We do the best we possibly can for all of them. But there's some that you take to, and others that somehow you may not. President Reagan was always a gentleman, and he would always stick his head in the cockpit and say something. it wouldn't be much to just as, how are you, and what's the weather like, or how long is it going to take us to get to those kinds of things that would be part of it. And he always remembered to say thank you on his way out, because they walk right by the cockpit when they come and go. That was part of that. But while I was in that squadron, I got to experience things such as the Camp David Accords, when Israel and Egypt, as a historic meeting when they came together at Camp David, and news was everywhere. And I flew Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, in, and then I flew Anwar Sadat, the President of Egypt, out. Just a luck of the draw that I was a command pilot at the time, and therefore I flew them. But I didn't think much at the time. You're busy just making sure that all goes well, and that you are very safe and timely and all of that. But later you get to thinking about the historic meaning of them coming together. It's still talked about, and so I guess it's one of those things when I look back on my career in the Marine Corps, those kinds of things like the Camp David Accords, flying to President Reagan to the 40th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy. That was kind of an interesting flight. We started in London, and the weather was not good. And once again, we still didn't have GPS. We didn't have night vision goggles and that. So I needed to hit Point de Hoc on the coast of Normandy. And yet I don't have any navigation. The weather was so bad, all I had was something that if I had altitude, I could point a needle at various places and find a base or a vortex or that, but I was too low. So my needles in the cockpit were just spinning, and I knew the direction I needed to go and all that, so we anticipated that could happen. And they put the USS Eisenhower, the Ike, the aircraft carrier, sitting in the middle of the English Channel. And it was there. And it also has a TACAN on board, so I could get a needle that would point at that aircraft carrier, and I did that. And then I could from there, knowing right where they were and where I was, I could then plot my course to Point de Hoc. So even though I couldn't see hardly a mile in front of me, we hit Point de Hoc. We hit it on time. It was a live television event. It was always fun. It's even more fun to talk about than it was to do. In fact, when we came back, and we came back across the Ike again, the president wanted to talk to them, and they were able to plug my radios, the helicopter radios, into the microphone on the ship, so that all the sailors could hear the president's voice across what they call the 1MC on that aircraft carrier. And President Reagan spoke to those sailors on the way back into London. I always thought that was rather unique and very much a Ronald Reagan thing to do. Camp David is, the president never liked to stay in Washington. This is my words, not his, but it seemed to me that whenever he had an opportunity, he was gone. So he would go to his ranch in California, and if he couldn't go that far, he would go to Camp David. So I spent a lot of time at Camp David. And there is a story I would tell about President Reagan that the cabins at Camp David are all named after flowers and that. His is called aspen, trees rather. And Aspen was an L-shaped rambler. And he would show movies. He was a big movie buff. He and his wife liked movies. And he would invite me as the head helicopter guy. He'd invite the commanding officer of Camp David and the head Secret Service man. He would invite us down on Friday and Saturday nights and let us watch. We would watch movies with him because they'd show a movie every Friday and Saturday night. And it got to be a routine, and you knew just how the routine was going to go. You'd go down, we'd gather a few minutes early. We'd ring the doorbell, and normally the president would come to the door, greet us, and take us in, and we'd already been pre-briefed, you'll sit here and there. And after a while, we knew the drill pretty well. Well, one day we rang the doorbell, and we're waiting, and Mrs. Reagan comes to the door. Well, you pick up on all these little changes when something like that happens. So that's a little different. And we walk in and we're standing in the foyer, and there's President Reagan sitting down in a chair in the foyer, and he started talking to us. And he says, you know, I'm a Western buff. I like cowboy things and riding horses and that, and we all knew that. And he says, so remember back in the Old West, cowboys would get these denim blue jeans, and they would then get into the river and get them wet, and then they'd let them dry on them, and they'd shrink down to the right size for that cowboy. And he says, you know, I thought I'd try that here at Camp David. So he put on a new pair of blue jeans and got into the swimming pool there at Aspen, and then he says, got it all wet. And he says, you know, it takes an awfully long time for denim to dry. And he says, I must have sat down more than I stood up. And about the time he stood up, and he had these bulbous knees where his blue jeans had dried in the sitting position that was there. So there were those kind of fun things that were part of that mission as we did. I thought he was a great president to do. So that was an interesting tour for me, HMX-1, and we did a lot of flying. We did it internationally. I mean, we went to Korea, we went throughout Europe, and it was just a good experience. But it wasn't Marine Corps mainstream, where you fly helicopters like Vietnam. So at some point you go back to the Marine Corps, and when I went back, I was a lieutenant colonel, and eventually was promoted to colonel. And the assignment I had was out in the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing when Desert Shield first, and then Desert Storm came on. And I was fortunate for me, I thought fortunate. My wife may not agree with that, going to war, but to me, Marines are supposed to go to war. And here was, I don't know if it's ever going to be a shooting war when it started or not, but this was a chance to deploy, and there may be combat in the future of that. So every Marine wanted to be in that. And I was fortunate that I was in a place where I could do that. So we deployed then first to Bahrain, and then we moved up to Saudi Arabia. And then we went into, whereas Desert Shield was a defensive place where we're actually defending Saudi Arabia from incursions from Iraq that would come down through Kuwait into the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. We were there as a tripwire to stop that from happening. But we didn't have enough to go on the offensive at that time, so Desert Shield was in the defense, and then in January of 1991, we went on the offense, Desert Storm. And I was, as I said, the operations officer of the Air Wing. So we had 2 Marine divisions and 1 Air Wing, and that was a group with an Army unit with tanks was assigned to us, and our task was to strike up through the southern part of Kuwait, and it was quite an interesting time. For one thing, Saddam Hussein had set all the oil fields in Kuwait on fire. So there was smoke everywhere. Even you could get out of it because the winds always blew in the desert, it seemed like. So at about 300 feet or less, you'd be in clear skies. But when you descended down into that, you're descending down into this black smoke. And the Marines attacked up through the southern part of Kuwait, ran through what they call the killing fields, because we thought that Saddam Hussein would be very strong there. So he had actually built berms out of sand higher than this house all along that coast of Kuwait. And those ground Marines had to go through that. And of course, aviation, our job was to do the best we could to prepare that way for them to go. And it was quite a success, actually. Whereas Desert Shield took a long time, months went by, and it seemed like we just sat there for months. In Desert Storm, it went very quickly. Once we started, we had an air war for about 30 days while we prepped things on the ground for the infantry then to go through. And I remember as we'd hit a lot of targets, and the infantry was moving, had gone through those berms and the fire wells and all of that. And the people up in Kuwait, the Iraqis were leaving. And I was in the command center that night, and we got reports back from our pilots that that the Iraqis had turned their lights on and were making a run for the Iraqi border. And of course, once they lit up and we could find them, it became the highway of death. It was eventually termed, and because we really did stop them at that point, and probably could have done them, but we did not go into Iraq at that time. Once we let them get back with some of their forces, that was pre-planned. That was just something that the decisions made at higher levels to do. So, and I think it worked out pretty well. The next time we go into Iraq, we stayed there a long time. At that point, we were able to come home. That was the first Gulf War. So, Desert Shield and Desert Storm were the first Gulf War. Now, of course, we've had several that have gone in there with Afghanistan and Iraq, and that is what we do. So I guess if I were to sum up my career and think about what it's affected and where it was, I started in that when we came back from Desert Storm and that, eventually I was promoted to Brigadier General. I was very honored that happened, and you never plan on making General in the Marine Corps, I can tell you that. I was just grateful that I'd been, as the jobs that I'd had a lot of opportunity, I'd just seen a lot of interesting things, and so being promoted to Brigadier General, that was just really above and beyond anything I would ever expected, and I was extremely honored to do that. There was tens of thousands of Marines who worked hard so that I could be that Brigadier General. I didn't do it, they all did it. And it was just something that Sue and I looked at each other and just smiled. From a small town in southwest Missouri called Rocky Comfort to being a general in the United States Marine Corps, and eventually I would become a full general, 4-star. And all the jobs that were in between, and working in the Pentagon, and the ability to see decisions made that were very impactful to our nation as we made decisions about how that would go, and even just making decisions about what weapons would we buy for the future. Those are things that aren't normally part of a career for people that serve for 4 years or so and then leave. So 34 years gives you quite a span of watching things happen. I mentioned when we began that I was a lieutenant in Vietnam and a colonel in Desert Storm, and that there's a sizable difference in the kinds of danger that you encounter as part of that. Vietnam was a shooting war down where I was. And Desert Storm, I'd have to go looking for someone to shoot me. It was I did fly some missions there, and I insisted that I do that, because how are you going to tell other people to go fly in danger if you're not going to go yourself? But it was almost impossible. They wouldn't give me, they gave me these softball missions where I'd go out and I'd land in the middle of the desert, and I was flying the same helicopter type, although a newer model that I flew in Vietnam. And we'd land in the desert, and we had fuel tanks aboard to refuel other helicopters that would come. The Cobras, the shooters would come in. So we'd set up what we call a forward area refueling and sit there. But no one was shooting at us. And I was at least a mile or two from where the shooting was. So I never really felt that my time in Desert Storm, that the danger measured up to the personal danger of Vietnam. But the other aspect of that in making decisions, sending people into danger, but not going yourself, but knowing they're going in harm's way at your call, was a very different mindset. And I'd have to tell you, I'd much rather be shot at than send someone else to get shot at. It just works on you that you're putting people in danger, and they don't all come back. And it'd be, I don't know, it just seems like my preference would be to be where the fighting is without sending people to fight. But that's part of growing, and that's part of being an officer and growing into the leadership roles that are part of that. Marines are wonderful. You just tell them what you want done, and they will get it done. There's no question about that. I've always felt that.
General Dake, would you give us your wisdom that you would pass along to future generations, perhaps touching on some of the life lessons that you learned and what you would hope that they would?
You know, I think, of course, when you get to be retired and you have time to think about the impact of things that are ongoing and what could you have done that would have impacted something, or what did your generation do, or how, and you think today, and of course we're talking here, we're in 2020, we're in August, we're getting ready to have an election, we have riots going on in some of our cities, we have all sorts of really hateful dialogue going back and forth between political parties and that. And I think that somebody needs to take responsibility for those things. And my generation has come up from the end of World War II. You know, I was born before World War II ended in 1944. It ended in 45, so I really spanned from that war to present. And I tell you, right after World War II, this country, everybody seemed to be patriotic, and everybody felt that their future was boundless. There wasn't anything that we couldn't do. And when anything we wouldn't be willing to try. We put people on the moon. We invented things here. We educated people beyond numbers that our nation had ever done before. So all that seemed to be back in those days to be a great promised nation, because what Tom Brokaw came to call the greatest generation made it so. Their attitude was what made that so. Their discipline, their willingness to look back at the founding fathers' vision of America and the freedoms that that vision entailed. And they would not allow people to routinely disparage the United States as an idea, as a flag, as a country. They would come on very strong against that. And now we seem to have lost the political will for our leaders, be they governors, be they whatever role, mayors, I don't know, military leaders, I'll count us all in that. Somehow in our generation, we have allowed what we are inheriting today to occur, and I'd like to see it stop. And I think that it takes people in the generations of their formative years to have the energy and they have to develop the desire for this nation to remain free and remain a power for good in the world. Without them sharing that vision, it will not occur. In fact, it'll go the other direction just as easily as it could. So if I had the wisdom that could be sent to a generation that I found about the age of when I was in Vietnam, the 24 to 30s and that, and maybe slightly younger, that seems to be the generations that are out in the streets, the ones that are taking fault, tearing down statues of leaders. Who would ever have thought in my generation that people would question George Washington as a person that should be respected, the father of our country? Who would have thought that Thomas Jefferson, that people would want to tear down his memorial? I don't know, I just find all that is disturbing. And if I had wisdom, it would be go back to the roots of the Constitution, to the Declaration of Independence, to the fact that God made us. And if you listen to the preamble and you listen to the Declaration of Independence, we talk about things that God gave us, not that man gave us, but things that are ordained to us by God. Certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those, we used to memorize all those kinds of things when I was going to elementary school. But when I talk to my grandchildren now, that's not necessarily part of the curriculum that they have. And I find that the loss of who America is will be something that this generation needs to hear. They need to know what is America? What are our roots? What is that great idea? Because that's all America, that's all freedom is as an idea. It's not something you can hold, but something you can feel. So it's one of those things that if we allow people to take that away from us. I can't remember the name of the philosopher that says, you've got a republic if you can keep it. Perhaps it was Benjamin Franklin, perhaps it was, but one of those founding fathers knew that this was perishable, that the idea of freedom could go away if you don't hold on to it. I like the quote that Ronald Reagan had that says that democracy can be lost in a single generation. It's not something that we give to our children in our bloodstream. It's something that every generation has to fight for, protect, and then pass on to the next generation to do the same. I've always thought that that's very true, and I'm witnessing that. And I hold my generation responsible for some of what I see today, because we've had people who did not stand. We have allowed teachers to stand in classrooms and talk about how bad America is and look at the woes of the world and lay them at the feet of the United States of America. Even when the Twin Towers came down on 9/11, there were people who thought we invited that through whatever policies we had or our conduct. I just rail against that. And I think that if I had anything to say to people that are coming in the future, remember what the United States stands for. Learn about the Declaration of Independence. You know, that declared that we would be a nation. But then we wrote the Constitution that gives the laws and the rules in which we're going to live by. And I think that one of the smartest things that our founding fathers did, anyone who's going to be a veteran, anyone who is going to wear the uniform of the United States and carry a weapon on behalf of the United States of America has to take an oath. And that oath is that they will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That there be a true faith and allegiance to the same. That they take that oath freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. And that they will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which they're about to enter, so help them God. That is an oath that they will support the Constitution of the United States. Not that they're going to support any president or the Congress or the Supreme Court. They're going to support the Constitution, which is that idea of freedom. So if I had any wisdom to pass on is go back to your roots, embrace it, know that it's important, and that you're going to have to protect it.
Thank you. One thing I would like to see if you would share with us some of your pictures and memorabilia.
Sure.
And medals.
I'd be happy to do that. I've kind of got it arranged so that this is kind of official presidential stuff, and that over there where you are, Cecilia.
Yes.
Where would you like to start? I just go, maybe we can't do it because of the way we are, but essentially, this is my wife now. If you can see.
Can we open this perhaps? Yes.
Let me open that.
Thank you. Okay, great. I'm sorry that those things.
No problem.
Thank you.
I've even got, this is my war rug, by the way.
It is.
It's from Afghanistan.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
But this is kind of a wall of personal things to me. It starts, this is the thing I got when I retired. It's got all of my ribbons, of course, my badge. This is a Presidential Service badge, but this is all the rank, from second lieutenant to four-star general.
Oh.
And when you think of that, my wife and I, this is my wife Sue and I in Pensacola, Florida in 1968. She is pinning my wings on me when I became my naval aviator wings, when I became a helicopter pilot. And then this is Sue, roll forward 34 years, or 32 years at that point. And this is Sue putting on my fourth star in Washington, D.C. We're standing at Marine Barracks 8th and I in Washington, D.C. to do that. So I've always kind of thought that was an interesting start here, go to there as a 4-star. I'm not sure how much of this will show up, but this is a picture of Marine generals. And as you can see, there's 7 of us. And we're all 4-star generals. And we're all on active duty at the same time. A very unique thing. That's why we all got together and had our pictures and mounted it. Because there's only really 2 4-star generals in the Marine Corps, the Commandant and the Assistant Commandant. But then we have 4-star generals that are Marines that serve various places around Washington. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for example, could be a Marine 4-star and that. So anyway, at one time there were 7 4-star generals in the Marine Corps, and that was kind of unique that we did all that. I don't know to see if you can get some of this or not,
Yes.
but this is actually in Washington, D.C., and I'm looking at the Constitution of the United States. And it just struck me, and I didn't pose for that picture, somebody caught it in doing that, but it just seemed like, I think so much of the Constitution of being an important document for America, that when that picture was taken, it kind of resonated with me, so I had it framed and I kept it. And then this is kind of what I call my I Love Me room, so kind of forgive me, this is all very egotistic.
We want to hear these things. We want to share it.
Of course, all the degrees I have from various places, but the bottom row there, and I don't, now this is, I'm the Board of Trustees for the College of the Ozarks. And then I was at the National War College, of course, Wharton School of Business, Pepperdine University, and then the University of Arkansas, the College of, don't try to get all that.
Excuse me.
This is just too much.
Thank you. All right, I'm sorry. Let me readjust here, if I may. Okay.
I'll give you a few of the things back here,
I
but
think
these
I'm
are
gonna-
just almost too much, Cecilia, for you to...
Okay. Well, I'm going to make this a little easier. Okay.
This is the presidential side of that, and this actually was taken, of course, that's President Reagan in the center, and we're sitting on the White House lawn. And the reason that the picture is kind of unique is that whenever you get on and off of Marine One, the president does, he gets on and off the side. And you can see the co-pilot, because that's the side, the door's on that side. So the co-pilot can always look at there, and he's waving, you know, but the pilot, you never see the pilot. So here was one that was taken nose on a White House lawn. You can actually see the pilot for a change, and I thought that was worth doing. Of course, everybody's got to have some picture of you in your uniform as you do it, so that was a picture in the suit. I don't even know what to say about that. That's just an I Love Me thing, I suppose it does. But this is President Carter, and we're actually out in Wyoming. We're out. He wanted to go fishing, and that's, so we're out at Yellowstone, I should say, is where we were and doing it. And we'd flown him in, and he took a picture with us as we did that. This picture is taken in the White House. And that Sue and I were invited over on a Memorial Day. And President Clinton, of course, was President of the United States at the time. And it's kind of interesting that you go over, and we call this a grip and grin. So, you know, very nice of them to do that. You always feel privileged to go to the White House. And anytime a president gives you his time, you need to take note of it. This is President Bush, of course, and it's taken, I still haven't found a place to put it yet, but he gave this to me, presented it to me at the College of the Ozarks when he was there as a speaker, and I introduced him and made a presentation of that. And that other person in the thing is President Jerry Davis, the president of the College of the Ozarks.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then this is, of course, the Reagans taking it to Camp David. And after I left that job, he invited me back to the White House with my family. So these are Sue and my children and I in the Oval Office with President Reagan. He had just given me this little presento, which he did. That was part of the a farewell that he did for me, and I've got that, of course, in frames. We're in Rome in this particular picture, and you note we're flying a different kind of helicopter. This is a Huey, the VH-1M. That's me down there. And that's my hole-in-one. But, okay, maybe that didn't have to be for posterity, but that one. And see, I don't know if there's anything over here that's really worth it. This particular award is a Silver Hawk Award for the senior aviator in the Marine Corps. I was that for a few years, and it's just a nice memento that we have. And those aircraft that are up there are the kinds of aircraft that I flew and the things that I did. So,
Thank you. Well, General Dake, we so appreciate you taking your time, giving us your story, and sharing your vision for the future generations. It's so important. And
well, I very much appreciate the opportunity, and I'm hopeful. You know, I have grandchildren, and then they're going to have children. I hope that they'll be able to tune in sometime and see what the old man looked like.
well, thank you for your service.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you all for what you do. I appreciate that.
Okay.